We are in ancient Athens. The year is 399 BC. A jury of several hundred adult male citizens has been summoned to pass judgment on the philosopher Socrates. By Greek standards, Athens was a very large city which controlled the entire area of Attica, about 700 square miles. It's a bit smaller than an average American county, but it was, of course, a sovereign state and a very powerful state. The entire adult male population probably numbered about 40,000. This is important because it meant that most people knew a great deal about the life histories of prominent men. Coming into court, they already knew a good deal more about Socrates than Americans would know about any prominent intellectual or artist in our country. For the citizens, Athens was a small town where people knew each other. An ordinary Athenian would know that Socrates was by trade a stonecutter and sculptor. He almost certainly worked on the great building projects that made Athens' Acropolis famous throughout history up until today. From an early age, he had taken a serious interest in philosophy. The philosophers he studied were asking big questions, such as, what is the universe? What is it made of? How did it come to be the way that it is? There were many different theories, and for a while, Socrates studied the latest scientific teachings. But he eventually turned his attention to more down-to-earth questions about human life. Socrates was disturbed by the growth of what today we call relativism. This is the notion that all values are subjective, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and moral principles are like ice cream flavors. All that matters is whatever you or I happen to prefer. This moral relativism was being taught by people known as Sophists, a word that can mean in Greek both wise man and wise guy. These Sophists taught different things, but for the most part, the effect of their teaching was to train young men to be skeptical of religion and tradition, and to be skillful in defending any cause, whether it was just or unjust. They were not all intentionally evil, but students, being students, the young men were happy to discover that their parents' moral principles were not, in fact, absolute. Socrates confronted the arguments of the Sophists and exposed their bad logic. But to do that, he also found himself refuting conventional Greek religion and moral traditions on many points. Socrates was not an atheist. He probably did believe that God or the gods exist, but they were morally good, which meant that many of the traditional stories told by poets like Homer had to be untrue, had to be lies. Court is about to begin, and the charges are being read out. Let's listen in. Socrates is hereby accused of impiety and corruption of the Athenian youth. The accused pleads innocent on both counts. Let us proceed. Asked to respond to the charges of corrupting the youth and impiety, Socrates sums up the accusation as, Socrates is an evildoer and a curious person, who searches into things under the earth and in heaven, and he makes the worse appear the better cause, and he teaches these aforesaid doctrines to others. Many of the jurors knew Socrates, and some must have admired him. They would have wondered, as thoughtful people have wondered ever since, how this opponent of skepticism and immorality came to be accused of undermining the religion and morals of Athenian young men. On the other hand, many Athenians regarded Socrates as a pest who spent his time challenging the cherished beliefs of his fellow citizens. Whenever he was asked a practical question, he responded by asking irritating counter-questions like, what do you mean when you say someone is brave? Or, what exactly is this piety you're speaking of? Some Athenians were excited by the challenge of his questions. Others were simply annoyed. Socrates will tell the jury that his troubles began when the Delphic oracle pronounced him the wisest of men. Refusing to believe such a statement, he walked the streets of Athens looking for wise men. And when, under questioning, they turned out to be anything but wise, they were naturally resentful. Socrates finally concluded that he might well be wiser than other men, if only because he did not think he knew what he did not know. In other words, ignorance was the beginning of wisdom. It was a good answer, though it was dripping in an irony that must have been offensive. Socrates knew that some of the accusation against him was motivated by politics. He had lived through the Athenian Golden Age, which witnessed an explosion of intellectual and artistic genius never equaled before or since by the human race. But it was also the age in which Athens turned an alliance of independent Greek cities into an empire that opposed her rival Sparta. The result was a decades-long war that exhausted the Greek world and spelled defeat and subjugation for Athens. Many Athenians opposed the war with Sparta, which they blamed on democrats, power-seeking leaders who had misled the people. Socrates and his student Plato were identified with this conservative faction, which included many of the best men and best families in Athens. When Athens lost this war, the famous Peloponnesian War, the most ruthless leaders of the aristocratic faction made a deal with Sparta and seized power over the city, and they used that power mercilessly to eliminate opponents and confiscate their wealth. Prominent in this group were men who had spent time with Socrates. Their short-lived regime was known as the 30, or the 30 Tyrants. After this faction was overthrown, peace was made on terms that no one could be prosecuted simply for having been a friend of the 30. This was part of a well-intentioned plan to restore unity to Athens, but it did not eliminate the festering hostilities that many Democrats felt toward all the reactionaries, including men like Socrates, who had in fact condemned the actions of the 30. Socrates had refused to take part in their illegal and immoral activities. Though his opponents had to come up with other charges because it was illegal to charge him with being a friend of the 30, the jurors could not have kept the careers of his students and friends out of their minds. Socrates' enemies accused him of teaching impiety and corrupting the youth. The prosecution. The first charge of the prosecution is impiety. Socrates is not accused of atheism, but of not worshiping the gods of Athens and of introducing new gods. Socrates tried to ridicule these charges as contradictory. How can he be impious and at the same time be accused of worshiping new gods? Illogical as they seem, the charges do not actually contradict each other. Socrates' alleged impiety was his failure or refusal to join in public praise and worship of the city's gods. Athena, the patron goddess of Athens, Poseidon, the god of the sea, and Zeus, the great god of all gods, the father of gods and men. For the Greeks, religion was not a matter of personal conviction or faith. What they insisted upon were public and collective rituals that guaranteed divine protection for their city. They had no interest in what you happened to believe personally. In his youth, Socrates had studied philosophers who taught that freaks of nature and unusual events were not portents sent by the gods as warnings, but only natural phenomena. These teachers, like most modern scientists, viewed miracles and omens as superstitious nonsense. Though Socrates gave up his scientific studies to concentrate on moral questions, he was nonetheless ridiculed by the comic playwright Aristophanes, who portrayed him as worshiping the clouds. This is in Aristophanes' great play, The Clouds. Socrates was a pure intellectual who opposed what he regarded as superstition, and he disliked the poets whom he accused of lying. But remember, the most influential Greek poets, Homer and Hesiod, were essentially religious writers whose works were treated almost as sacred scripture. Of course, Socrates, like many Greek thinkers, found Homer's gods sometimes cruel and all too human, exactly as today many people find the God of the Old Testament cruel, vindictive, even barbaric. But unlike latter-day village atheists such as Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, Socrates did not wish to debunk his people's religion, only to purify it. The Athenians were a very religious people, religious to the point of fanaticism and superstition. St. Paul, when he visited Athens 5 centuries later, opened his lecture by saying, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in all things ye are very religious." Such people were naturally offended by Socrates' free-thinking approach to their traditional religion. Charge number 2, corrupting the youth. Socrates' accuser, Meletus, emphasized this charge. In Plato's version of what Socrates said at the trial, the philosopher makes a monkey out of the accuser by showing that, according to him, everyone else in Athens had a good influence on young men, but Socrates only corrupted them. The jury, however, was not swayed by his brilliance. Obviously, they were thinking about Socrates' many students and friends who turned out badly. Alcibiades, for example, very powerful politician and general, notorious philanderer who had travestied religious mysteries. He was also a political two-timer and traitor. Plato's relative, Critias, was not only a ruthless dictator who had his opponents and rivals put to death, he was also a moral skeptic and a political cynic. Religion and morality, he had argued, were invented by the weak as a means of preventing the strong and capable from doing whatever they wanted. The strong have a natural right to rule. At the trial, Socrates jokingly pretends that the charge of corruption really stemmed from a comic play. He was referring to Aristophanes' Clouds, in which the philosopher is shown contradicting traditional Athenian religion and teaching the disciples at his think tank to revere only the ever-flowing clouds, a perfect image of uncertainty and instability. When a father in the play sends his son to be educated by Socrates, the young man ends up losing all moral sense. At the end, he beats his father and threatens to do the same to his mother. Athenian comedy was a riotous and irresponsible form of drama, but Aristophanes was a serious political thinker who deplored the war with Sparta probably as much as Socrates must have. He also knew something important that Socrates apparently had not learned, and that was that young men are morally unstable. If they were once taught to despise their parents' teaching and traditional religion, few of them will go on to high school and college to search for higher truths. They'll be content with skepticism and atheism. Like the student punks of the 1960s, these young men will lapse into selfish hedonism and contempt for their own country, which they will cheerfully betray. The jury of several hundred Athenians found Socrates guilty, but by a narrow margin. In a trial of this kind, the convicted criminal had the right to propose a lesser punishment, such as exile or a stiff fine, as an alternative to the death penalty. Instead, Socrates took the high road, mocking the insincere accusers and dim-witted jurors by demanding to be feasted in the town hall as if he were an Olympic victor. Many more jurors voted for death than had voted to convict. I do not say they were entirely right, but Socrates himself was hardly a civil libertarian. He acknowledged that the Athenians had the right to put him to death if the charges were true. And when his friends arranged for him to break out of jail, he refused, insisting that he owed his very existence and identity to the laws and customs of Athens. In killing him, they were making a mistake, but he still owed them loyalty and obedience. In death, Socrates proved he was a loyal son of his city. Then what do we conclude from this? Socrates was very obviously a virtuous man who with his students did more to advance philosophical thought than anyone before or since. Nonetheless, the charges against him were more than a little true. In teaching critical thought, he had in fact undermined the morals of Athenian young men. His more brilliant student Plato finally acknowledged, in one of his last works, that we must not criticize our country's institutions and morals in the presence of the young. Few American teachers are willing to take any responsibility for the effect of their teaching on American youth. But when we look out at so many of the children today, we would be sorely tempted to order a free round of hemlock for all the profs.